This mini-series video is brought to you by Navy Federal Credit Union. The Cold War had turned particularly frigid by October 1962. There was tension between the Soviets and Americans throughout the world, including right in America's backyard, in the Caribbean. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev tried to gain a military advantage over the United States by secretly shipping nuclear-capable ballistic missiles and bombers to the island of Cuba under the control of communist dictator Fidel Castro. On October 16th, the CIA informed President John F. Kennedy that high-altitude U-2 spy planes had discovered the construction of Soviet missile launching pads being set up in the interior of Cuba. Navy Crusader jets flying dangerous low-level reconnaissance over Cuba confirmed the presence of these weapons of mass destruction. Kennedy's top advisors debated various courses of action, which included accepting the presence of missiles in Cuba, or launching airstrikes and an amphibious invasion to remove them. Kennedy concluded that he could not allow the Soviets to keep the threatening missiles and bombers in Cuba only 90 miles from Florida. At the same time, he did not want to trigger World War III by attacking Soviet forces. So Kennedy settled on a third option. He directed the U.S. Navy to stop the transport of missiles and bombers to Cuba with a quarantine, another way of saying a blockade. If the Soviets refused to stop their merchant ships for inspection or tried to ignore the American blockade, they would be responsible for the consequences. Kennedy turned to Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral George W. Anderson, and gave him the critical mission. "It looks like this is up to the Navy," Kennedy said. "Mr. President, the Navy will not let you down," Anderson replied. As the Navy deployed warships into the Caribbean, the White House announced on October 22nd that the President would address the nation that evening. The world held its breath.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
The quarantine operation was assigned to Vice Admiral Alfred Ward, commander of the Second Fleet, under the direction of Admiral Robert Dennison, commander-in-chief of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. Soon, aircraft carriers Enterprise and Independence, along with other warships, took up positions in the eastern Caribbean. American destroyers deployed to waters northeast of Cuba and established a quarantine line beyond the range of potentially hostile aircraft. Simultaneously, the U.S. Navy shore-based planes patrolled the Atlantic Ocean looking for Soviet ships. Supported by cruisers, American destroyers set up patrol areas 60 miles apart along the quarantine line. Boarding parties from the USS Joseph P. Kennedy and other destroyers stopped and searched non-Soviet merchant ships. After several tense days, all Soviet ships reversed course and headed for home before reaching the American quarantine line. The Soviets had blinked.
This is Radio Moscow. Premier Khrushchev has sent a message to President Kennedy today. The Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
With American determination now clear, Khrushchev communicated to Kennedy that he would remove offensive weapons from Cuba if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. By the end of November, Atlantic Fleet surface ships and reconnaissance planes verified that Soviet merchant ships were heading from Cuba to the USSR, their decks loaded with missiles and bombers. The Navy had successfully accomplished the mission assigned by the President without having to fire a shot. Navy Federal Credit Union, with online financial services and offices around the world, is proud to be a sponsor of this series. Navy Federal, we serve where you serve. For more information on this naval heritage topic, visit our website, at www.history.navy.mil.